Thank you, Harriet. And thank you to Ian for inviting me to speak at this conference, and thanks to Franey for getting me over here. If we whack the first slide up, that would be fantastic, or am I responsible for doing that? I am. That's cool. So this is my first time in South Africa, and it's a real treat to be here. And I must say, I felt very at home coming on the drive from Pietermaritzburg to Howick. Basically, all the trees were eucalypts, black wattles, or casuarinas. It was quite at home. It could be an east coast of Australia. It was fantastic. So when this conference started on Monday, I was actually back in Melbourne, Australia, at this concert here, Midnight Oil. Don't know if you know Midnight Oil. They're a really big rock band in Australia, iconic band, politically charged, high conservation motives and ethics. And it's the first time in 17 years these guys have been touring. And you might think that's sort of a bit, I don't know, what could I say? I'm a big fan, put it that way. I guess the link to this talk is that Peter Garrett, 17 years ago, took time out of the band to go into politics. And he eventually became Environment Minister for Australia. And one of the big unsung, I guess, achievements he had in that time was committing $180 million Australian over 5 years to expand our reserve system. And that equates to about 1.9 billion South African rand. So this will be a nice little talk about how we've done that in Australia. So I come from, I guess, various perspectives in terms of having worked for government in the past for establishing protected areas, having been in NGOs and establishing private protected areas and helping Indigenous people protect areas on their land, and also in terms of being a private landowner myself. I own 130 hectares of box ironbark country in central Victoria. And I also have had past roles in universities as well, in Deakin University. So this is what Australia's reserve system looked like back in 1997. This is about the time when Australia signed up to the Convention on Biological Diversity. At that time, we basically had a reserve system made up of each state and territory basically had developed their own system. So we're a federated nation. The states basically have control for land management and conservation, and they basically develop reserve systems on their own. So we had about 8 different, essentially, reserve systems established in that country. But back around that time, the Australian government came together with the states to say we actually want to have a coordinated approach to developing our reserve system. So this is what we did. If I can get this to work. Oh, it's jumping ahead. No, I'm going to go back, sorry. It's a bit of a delayed process here. So this is what we've got today when it comes up. This is what we've done. So we've gone from about 70% of the continent to about 18% of the continent in the space of 20 years. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we've done that. But very briefly, I'll say we've also done similar things in the marine space as well. We've gone from having quite a small reserve system, the dark blue being the no-take and the light blue being the multi-use areas, to some 30% of our economic zone today. So that's still undergoing a bit of controversial decision-making at a federal level. I won't talk much. I'm going to talk about the terrestrial system today. But if you want to know more about our marine space, we put out a book last year called Big, Bold and Blue to say how we've actually done that in Australia. So some interesting learnings about what worked and what didn't work there. So in terms of the land space, we've done this through various means to, I guess, expand our system. We've seen the growth of the forest estate, so a lot of controversy in Australia over forestry. The federal government worked with the states to say, let's work out where the reserve should be, where the state forest should be, and that really came out with a fairly comprehensive system that used good scientific principles to determine, I guess, that forest reserve system. We've seen the states also upgrade other land that wasn't forest reserve areas, so grasslands, for instance, for these endangered plains wanderers. We've seen the growth of the interest in the indigenous space, and that area is going to come up very soon, and large-scale interest from indigenous people to manage their land for conservation and declare indigenous protected areas on their country. We've seen the growth of individual landowners wanting to protect their sites in perpetuity, and you'll have to just excuse the 5-second delay that's happening here. So through conservation covenants in Australia, and we've also seen the growth of the land trust sector as well. So individual NGOs buying large chunks of country, particularly with the support of the Australian government. So this is how we've seen the reserve system change over time. So if you look at the first bar, the blue bar, and you can't quite see the year at the bottom there, but that's year 2000. it was made almost entirely of public land, so our national parks and nature reserves. Today in 2016, the bar at the end, you can see that half the reserve system now comprises of indigenous and private protected areas. So a big shift in the governance types in terms of our total makeup. And we've done this through, I guess, having strong science embedded in strong policy and strategy, which has been really important for helping us grow the system. And we've used the principles of comprehensiveness, adequacy and representativeness to guide our system. And we've used things like bioregions, which have been kind of, I guess, the baseline for determining where new reserves should be. So we've got about 89 bioregions in Australia. We break that down to sub-regions, about 419 odd sub-regions. And these are units of similar geology, geomorphology, vegetation type. And these are the areas where we say, okay, have we got enough reservation in these? And if not, we need to get some new reserves, basically. So when we sort of look at, it's not just about area growth in Australia, we sort of look at representation and we'll take it at a broad level, let's look at the bioregions. And so we take our old conventional biological diversity targets of 10% and apply them to bioregions. We've made some pretty good progress. So back in 2000, we had about just under 40% of our bioregions meeting that 10% target. And today we're well over 60%. So we've really been quite targeted about where the new reserve should be. Now, of course, you know, we signed up to new agreements with Aichi Target 11, looking at 17%, and again, in Australia, interpreting that at the bioregional level. Let's think about 17% of each bioregion. Then we have increased as well, but we've still got some work to do. So the orange indicates there, we've been going from less than 20% of our reserves, or our bioregions have been well reserved, to over 40% in the space of 20 years. So we've made good progress, but there's still a fair bit to go. And this gives you an indication about where the priorities still exist. So the dark green areas are those that are well reserved, the light green areas are those that are under reserved. Notice though that everything at least has some level of reservation. If you take it down to the sub-regional level, you can see quite a few white areas there, and there's still areas that have got no reservation whatsoever. Again, in Australia, we kind of take this down to a finer level still, and we look at vegetation types as surrogates for ecosystems. And I guess the key point in this graph is that the bottom bar there is our National Reserve System in 2002, and the dark green areas are those ecosystems that obtained, I guess, the reservation standard. The brown areas on the far right are those that are unprotected. And if you compare that to the top bar, which is 2014, we've made progress in terms of getting ecosystems up to the standard and reducing those that are unprotected altogether. So some of the mechanisms. So Indigenous protected areas are agreements between the Australian government and Indigenous people where they have some management control over land. And that could be under tenures such as freehold tenure, Crown land, joint management of national parks, for instance. And they're basically agreements that are signed. They aren't binding in perpetuity, but they do involve money for ranger positions and on-ground works. And they'll often be predicated on a robust management plan having been developed beforehand, which is agreed to by all the community. And these are the Indigenous protected areas in Australia. So the dark red areas are where our IPAs are, covering much of Central Australia and Northern Australia. The areas in purple are other Indigenous lands, which may well in future become IPAs as well. So there's still some real growth there to happen in this space. But again, this is a reserve type that's only occurred in the last 20 years or so, and it's made some really big progress. We've seen state governments also step up and particularly tap into the Australian government's 2/3 offer for purchase price for high priority properties. And so this has been a real boon for, I guess, purchasing land in Australia from a state government perspective and an NGO perspective. And I've been involved in buying quite a number of these sites, and they might look sort of fairly unattractive, but these are the last remnants of things like native grasslands and grassy woodlands left in southeastern Australia, of which had almost no reservation prior to this process taking place. Earlier this year, we put out an article in the IUCN journal Parks that looked at privately protected areas globally and issues around guidance and policy, and in particular documentation. And we know that historically PPAs are fairly underreported, but those that are in the World Database on protected areas at the moment, Australia, South Africa and the US are right up there in terms of both numbers and areas. But as I said, we know they're underreported. Australia actually has about 5,000 privately protected areas in our country, covering almost 9 million hectares. So we're certainly up there in terms of number, well and truly over there in terms of the area that's currently in place. So this is made up of things like conservation covenants. These are agreements between often a state agency, a department or an NGO with ability to sign a covenant and a net landowner, almost always in perpetuity. And so these are legally binding agreements that sit on title and so therefore qualify as long-term protected areas. And we've got about 5,000 of those individual properties out there. And we've also seen the rise of the land trusts as well, so about 140 properties, often very large properties, owned by land trusts. And you can see the demand and the growth has been increasing dramatically over time as well. So, you know, a constant growth in people interested in signing up covenants on their properties. So what's driven this growth? I guess it's one, an increased interest from landowners themselves to protect their bush blocks that they might have or their back paddocks with some good vegetation that they might not use for I guess, intensive agriculture. We've seen the rise of incentive payments. So a lot of the early covenants were signed in a very altruistic manner, so there was no money exchanged. Increasingly these days, incentive payments to sign up has been really important. We've seen revolving funds. I'm not going to talk in detail about those. Matt Hardy's going to be talking about revolving funds in the next session, and I'll let him talk in more detail about those. The big one has been the National Reserve System program, as I said, the Australian government's program that offered 2/3 of the purchase price for properties of high conservation value and to pick up high priority bioregions. And the rise of conservation philanthropy in Australia. So perhaps like South Africa, philanthropy is not a huge deal in Australia. Certainly in the US, where my organisation has its home base, it's a huge deal. But the culture in Australia hasn't been for a large-scale philanthropy for conservation. We're changing that over time, but we're still taking a while to get there. So the conservation covenants, we kind of know where they are. They're on the areas, unsurprisingly, where the freehold land is, mostly in southern and eastern Australia. How are these things funded? So most of them haven't been overly targeted, it's fair to say, and haven't had a whole lot of investment put in. But one of them in Tasmania has, and this was funded by the Australian government, up to $30 million, so quite a large amount of money in Australian terms, to secure about 255 covenants. Now, one could say that's great, that's a great outcome and picked up a lot of underrepresented ecosystems. Some of the purchase prices we've been paid, though, were basically the same as the property prices. So quite large amounts of money changing hands to secure a covenant, which I suspect is probably unsustainable in the long term, but nonetheless it's secured those. In other states, it's really often relying on landowners to come to them in terms of how covenants are signed up. So from my time back in, I guess, the public service and talking about privately protected areas and covenants, there was sort of this sort of underlying assumption that covenants weren't really that strong, weren't really that great, weren't secure in the long term. So with Matt Hardy and some other colleagues in Melbourne, we set out to actually have a look at this and found that only 8 out of the 6,800 covenants have been taken off title. And so that's a pretty small amount, and you compare that to, say, the public estate where we've seen some degazettles here and there and chunks taken out. That's still a pretty strong endorsement for covenant security. We also found that breach numbers are pretty small, but we suspect they're probably underreported, it's fair to say. What we didn't look at, though, was alterations to conditions or to boundaries, which would also perhaps impact on covenants in certain places. And we do know that covenanting agencies aren't that keen to go to court over some of these things, so it's something worth looking at in the future. So the land trusts in Australia, we've had a fairly young land trust start, particularly compared to here in South Africa, where you've had a much longer history of having land trusts. So we've got 2 national land trusts and a number of state-based land trusts, and they're picking up quite large properties with sort of iconic wildlife and picking up large gaps in the system, such as these. Revolving funds are another mechanism that's being used, and again, I won't talk in detail about this, but really the concept is that land trusts have been basically buying land, on-selling it with a protective covenant to another private landowner. The money from that sale goes back into the fund, and you go and do it all again. So in theory, it's a self-sustaining way of securing land in the long term. The other role that land trusts have been playing is helping establish these really large connectivity networks in Australia, either through buying a large property in the region and other landowners become interested, or they themselves going out and doing stewardship around those properties to create these really large-scale landscape connectivity projects. And we're seeing that at sort of finer scales in places like Victoria as well. So what's actually being protected here? What are privately protected areas actually doing for our reserve system? We know that all acquisitions through the National Reserve System program have been strategic. The only way that they were funded is if they filled a gap in a bioregion or in an ecosystem type that was underrepresented. Covenant programs are a bit of a mixed bag. So the Tasmanian program, for instance, was highly targeted. Other programs, as I said, are really happy to let potential covenantors come to them. So it could be quite common vegetation types being protected. Revolving funds are a bit of a mixed bag in the sense they're quite a niche because you've got to be able to on-sell that property to someone that wants to buy it and often live there. And so you're not looking at big desert properties, you're not looking at perhaps grassland properties, you're probably looking at more bush blocks where you can have a house and actually have it as a saleable item. So, we've got a lot of mechanisms, we've got a lot of policies, we've got a lot of science, and there was a lot of money. And, we would have thought that we're tracking along quite nicely to meet our Aichi target 17. Well, not quite. We've seen a few bumps in the road, particularly in the last 5 years in Australia, which are worth noting and are good lessons to be learned. We've seen, I guess, a decline in land purchase budgets in a number of states, basically cut totally, and declining in other areas. But probably the big kicker in all of this has been the loss of the federal government's National Reserve System program bucket. And this has really stymied the growth of acquisitions in this country, both by states and the NGO sector. And this graph gives you an indication about how we've gone. So we've been ticking along prior to 2008 at about a few $1 million a year for land acquisitions. Then we got this big kick of some $180 million over 5 years. And then in 2013, that was basically the end of that. And we haven't seen another large bucket of money come back in for land acquisitions in Australia. We've also seen some other disturbing trends, it's fair to say as well, some fairly questionable decisions about allowing extractive uses back in national parks, grazing in the Alpine National Park, for instance, against all scientific evidence. Threats from coal mines to privately protected areas, including those that have been purchased by the Australian government or with 2/3 Australian government funding. Some private protected areas didn't quite go through for various means. And probably the big underlying thing we don't talk about much is significant loss in the public sector, particularly around protected area policy. And that loss of corporate knowledge about how to do this has been a real problem that we face, and it's going to be hard to get that back in to make sure we continue this work. So it's not just about our National Reserve System, we're complemented by a whole range of other mechanisms out there in the landscape, Land for Wildlife being one of those. These are voluntary mechanisms between often state agencies and private landowners. They're not binding, but they offer management advice. And proudly people are wearing the sign. Some 13,000 properties have been signed up under this process, covering quite a large hectareage. And these have been really popular in many states. We're seeing, quite strong growth in Tasmania, for instance, in southeast Queensland. But in places like Victoria, where it all started, we've seen a fair tapering off and a stagnation, I guess, of growth. And perhaps part of that's because of an ideological shift from these voluntary, non-binding mechanisms to much more targeted type approaches, conservation tenders, which have really become popular in Australia. So these are basically where governments or other agencies are offering up money in a landscape and asking landowners to bid for that money and saying, what will you do on your properties for conservation over a 5 or 15-year agreement to manage your property? The values of that property are assessed, their bid goes into a black box formula, and those that are seen to be offering the best value for money are funded. And so we're seeing a whole swathe of these agreements, and you call them short to medium term agreements across the landscape. And they're great for government in the sense that they're targeting ecosystems that they want. One of the dilemmas, of course, is there's often no strategy after those agreements finish as to what happens. So we've invested a lot of money, $178 million in this process, but what is the long-term objective? And we've still got to work that out. Land care is another one which you might be familiar with. Again, this is really helping production owners, farmers, etc. Some 40% of farmers are involved in land care. Lots of groups, 5,400 groups, so very strong participation. And that's grown over time as well, from about 2,000 back in the mid-90s to consistently now over 5,000 groups. So strong buy-in. So all in all, there's a lot of mechanisms out there on private land in Australia for conservation. One of the dilemmas we have is that I've cobbled this information together from all different sources. There's no single repository, even within certain mechanism types. It's all over the place. So we don't have a good feel for what's actually happening out there in the landscape, which doesn't do the sector any favours whatsoever in terms of making the case for how many people are involved in this. And these are ultimately your constituents which are important for government to know. We also don't have a good handle on often where they are. So we used to produce great maps back in the mid-1990s about levels of uptake of land care. This map here is the only map of conservation covenants in Australia. It's from 2009. So we're still, we're not really capitalising on the landowner buy-in here to make the case to federal politicians or state-based politicians about the level of interest in this work. So some of the challenges we face, I haven't talked in great detail about this, but pastoral leasehold tenures often don't mix well with conservation. They're very old legislation, and you have to graze no matter what. And so having a conservation covenant on top doesn't often help you, or indeed it can't be legally possible in some cases. So we're seeing conflicts here between Australian government or taxpayer money buying land for conservation, but we can't put a protective agreement on top. That's something we have to sort out. Probably like here in South Africa, there's very few mechanisms to prevent underground resource extraction. These are often owned by the state or the federal government, and it's become increasingly a conflict in our country, particularly for investments of taxpayer money for conservation, and all of a sudden there's a threat for underground mining of those same resources. We are seeing some states introduce legislation that do prevent mining on private land, and we'll see how we go getting that through Parliament. Some of the other challenges, covenantors, and I guess that change of ownership over time, covenants being handed down to the next generation or being sold. What is the level of interest in that new owner in terms of doing what the original covenantor wanted? And as I said, coordination of approaches hasn't been great, but it's increasing. So the Australian Land Conservation Alliance has been formed from the land trusts, increasingly now going to expand out to other forms of private land conservation. It's worth doing a bit of myth busting, and for those that attended the World Parks Congress back in 2014 in Australia, you might have heard our Environment Minister at the time get up and say we've reached our 17% target, and that means we've reached our Aichi target 11, and that's not quite the case. In Australia, it's been a long-term policy around making sure it's the bioregions and ecosystems that are at 17%, not the whole country. And so we saw, I guess it's been a bit concerning, we're seeing that creep into the public service as well, that it's been job done essentially, and no, it's a fair way off job done. We've also seen this sort of creeping in about anything over 17% is redundant. That getting over 17% of a certain ecosystem is redundancy. Well, again, no, these are minimum targets, it's at least, and we've just got to keep reminding folks that that is the case. And we've also seen a little bit of creeping in of this concept that, climate change is making reserve purchases or new acquisitions a shaky investment because they don't know what's going to be happening there in 10, 20 years' time. And again, I think changing the narrative to say these are safe places for nature to adapt and evolve is a smarter way to go than saying we're just buying this site for this rice flower or this pygmy possum over here. So thinking carefully about the narrative, that if we think something might not be there in 10 or 100 years' time, we're not pinning all our hopes on that reserve for that purpose, but we're talking about this as a safe place for nature more broadly. So just some, I guess, needs and things going forward. We need clearer targets. While we have great targets in many cases, often some targets are conflicting in different policy documents. We need to get better at that. Adequacy we don't define really well. We're good at sort of working out percentages of bioregions and things like that. We don't really have good definitions of adequacy, and nor have we incorporated in things like connectivity and ecosystem services that Aichi Target 11 requires as well. And tracking progress. A lot of the stats I put up here have been developed by WWF, and I've been involved in some of these projects with WWF, but the governments don't typically track a lot of these data sets, and so it's the NGO sector that's typically doing that, and we need to get better at that as a sector generally. In terms of funding and finances, we need to really bring back a dedicated land purchase fund. The critical thing about that fund was that it provided leverage from the philanthropic community, and it's very hard to get leverage if you don't have something to leverage off. And so you actually need a bucket there that's dedicated for this purpose. It's not going to be sucked into consolidated revenue or some other program down the track. It's been very important, we've found. We need smarter financing options around tax, and I know South Africa's been doing some great thinking about this. some more efficient use of offsets. There's a lot of money being spent out there on offsets in Australia at the moment with a lot of our mining sector. They could be much better used to grow the reserve system. Just in terms of legal, as I said, we need some tenure reform to protect some of these investments. Even land owned by state governments on pastoral land hasn't been formally reserved, even though we've bought this land for conservation. And we need to kind of resolve that pretty quickly. We need to think about some new models for protected areas in different landscapes too. So in mining landscapes or agricultural landscapes, how might we have more flexible models to incorporate some of these multiple use types into our system? So some key lessons that might be of interest to South Africa is that a lot of this work, well, most of this work is really based on strong science underpinnings, but it's not been a dogmatic science underpinning. So there's enough flexibility in there to change as things change over time. So our bioregions have changed over time. We don't say where the reserve should be, we have general principles about where they should be. As I said, a dedicated fund for strategic growth makes a really big difference, and it's certainly something to consider. And the Nature Conservancy in the US has a land preservation fund, and that's been a really important tool for us in terms of enabling quick acquisitions over time rather than having to go and find the money when something's on the market. The other key thing that the National Reserve System had was a dedicated policy group which facilitated national coordination. That policy group's gone now, and we have seen pretty much the states revert back to their own territory in this space. So we have lost quite a bit of national coordination. So it's great having the buckets of money out there, but having a policy group that's dedicated towards bringing people together has also been important. The diversity of approaches we've had in Australia have been really important. So from land trusts to covenantors to indigenous protected areas have been, I guess, a real strength for us to enable us to work on different land tenures where the classic public protected areas simply wouldn't be viable. And I guess the last one is don't be complacent in selling the success and vision of what you've achieved. And I actually see my role in some of this failure in Australia is not having promoted the success of every single one of those purchases we made in government and in the NGO sector. I guess as a sector, we were a bit complacent. We thought, well, we're making great progress here and everyone knows about it. Well, the fact that it was so easy to lose that money so quickly under what you could term a friendly government with almost no reaction indicates that we can't be complacent about this. And I'll finish by saying that we should be putting things like a national reserve system up in lights, just like my rock heroes, Midnight Oil. Thanks very much.